Maria Green stood in the bustling courtroom, her heart beating fast, but her mind, sharp and focused. The case in front of her was a routine civil matter, one she had prepared for meticulously in the weeks leading up to the hearing. As she gathered her papers and took her seat in front of the judge, she had no idea that this day would be different, that this case would set off a chain of events that would forever alter the course of her career. The judge was a middle-aged man with graying hair and a stern expression. Judge Curtis James was known for his quick decisions and even quicker temper. Many lawyers spoke in hushed tones about him, preferring to avoid crossing his path or making him angry. Maria had always respected the judicial system and its authority, but today something felt different. As the case began, she could feel the tension building in the room. Maria stood up with poise, addressing the court. She made her arguments clearly and with confidence. As the case progressed, she noticed Judge James growing more restless, his brow furrowing as he glanced at the clock, as if eager to move on to the next matter. But Maria was resolute. She wasn't going to rush through this for anyone, even if it meant going over the allotted time. At one point during her argument, the judge interrupted sharply, his voice loud and cutting. Maria paused for a moment, surprised by the sudden interruption. She knew she had made a point he disagreed with, but she wasn't going to back down. Instead, she calmly but firmly addressed his concerns, explaining her position again. She had made it clear in her preparation and was confident in her legal reasoning. Judge James, however, did not take kindly to her response. His eyes narrowed with irritation, and for a split second Maria felt a chill run down her spine. But she didn't flinch. She kept her composure, maintaining the professional demeanor she had worked so hard to develop over the years. But then it happened suddenly, without warning. Judge James slammed his gavel down hard. The sound echoed throughout the room. He declared her behavior contemptuous and imposed a hefty fine of several $100s for disrespecting the court. Maria's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't believe what had just happened. She had never been fined in her career, and certainly not for something as trivial as disagreeing with the judge or standing her ground. She looked around the room, trying to make sense of the moment, but the faces of the other lawyers and court staff were unreadable. Her hands shook as she gathered her papers to leave the courtroom. Still in shock, she could feel the eyes of the room on her, but there was no time to react, no time to question what had just transpired. She walked out of the courtroom, her thoughts racing at 100 miles per hour, wondering what had triggered this sudden outburst from the judge. What had she done wrong? Why was she being punished like this? Her pride burned as she made her way down the courthouse steps, but deep down, a question lingered: what had really caused Judge James to react this way? As Maria stepped into the sunlight outside the courthouse, she knew one thing for certain: this fine was only the beginning of something much bigger than a simple courtroom misunderstanding. The days following the fine were a whirlwind for Maria as she tried to process what had happened. She had expected some backlash or even a stern warning, but a fine for contempt of court seemed excessive and unjust. She spent hours reviewing her notes from the case, replaying every word, every moment in her head. Had she crossed a line? She couldn't see it, not at all. But then why had Judge James reacted so harshly? It didn't make sense. Maria tried to reach out to her colleagues, hoping for advice or support, but what she encountered instead was a wall of silence. The first person she called was Lori Grant a senior partner at a prestigious law firm and a mentor who had always encouraged Maria to stand tall in the face of adversity. Lori was someone Maria trusted, someone who had guided her through some of the toughest moments of her legal career. But when Maria explained the situation, Lori's voice sounded distant and hesitant. "Maria, I don't know what to say. Judge James is a powerful man," Lori replied after a long pause. "You know how he is. People don't mess with him. Maybe it's best to just pay the fine and move on." Maria felt a pang of frustration. Lori's response wasn't what she expected at all. She had always admired Lori's boldness, her refusal to back down in the face of injustice. Yet now, Lori seemed unwilling to challenge the system, even when it was clear that something wasn't right. "I don't think that's right, Lori. I didn't do anything wrong. I need to find out why it has happened," Maria said, her voice firm, even though a doubt was creeping in. Lori hesitated. "Maria, I understand, but this could get ugly. The judge has friends, connections. You don't want to make an enemy of him. You're just starting out. Don't burn bridges. Maria didn't respond. She didn't need to hear more. She ended the call, feeling a growing sense of isolation. The people she thought would have her back were now backing away, and the injustice she felt deep in her bones was quickly turning into something else. A fire, one that would not be easily extinguished. Her mind raced as she pondered what to do next. She could feel herself becoming more determined with each passing hour. Something was off. There had to be more to this than a simple misunderstanding. She was a lawyer, a professional. She knew when something wasn't right, and this fine was wrong on so many levels. Over the next few days, Maria kept a low profile at the office, quietly working on other cases, while she began to investigate Judge James. She pulled up court records, spoke with clerks and junior attorneys who had worked with the judge before, and started asking questions, quietly, carefully. She was trying to gather information that could shed light on why he had singled her out, but nothing stood out at first. However, as she dug deeper, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. There were whispers, unspoken accounts of Judge James's bias, especially towards women of color, particularly those who were outspoken or ambitious. It wasn't just a rumor. There were cases where his rulings had been questioned, where his conduct had been challenged, but the system had always protected him. Maria's stomach tightened as the pieces began to fall into place. It wasn't just about a fine. This was personal. Maria was starting to wonder if Judge James had targeted her not for her behavior, but for something much bigger, her growing influence in the legal community. But how could she prove it? And why would a judge like James risk so much just to take down one young lawyer? The more she thought about it, the clearer it became. Maria was not just any lawyer. She was a black woman who had climbed the ranks in a field where people like her were often overlooked. She had a voice, and that voice was starting to echo through the legal world. Maybe that was the real reason Judge James had taken such drastic action. Maria knew she had to act fast. But the question was, how? The court system was a labyrinth, and she was about to venture into the heart of it, risking everything she had worked for. But she wasn't about to back down now. Maria spent the next few days in a quiet, determined state. She reviewed case files, studied every ruling from Judge James she could find, and began to notice a troubling pattern. It wasn't just her recent fine that seemed out of place. She uncovered a series of cases where Judge James had been unusually harsh toward black attorneys and women of color, especially those who had made a name for themselves in the legal community. Maria had always known the legal world could be biased, but seeing the facts laid out in front of her brought an unsettling clarity. It wasn't just about her disagreement with the judge in that courtroom. It was about something far deeper. The subtle but powerful prejudices embedded in the system, the kind that Maria herself had worked so hard to overcome. But there was one thing she still didn't understand. Why had Judge James singled her out? Yes, she was outspoken and ambitious, but so were many other attorneys. What had truly set her apart in his eyes? As the days passed, Maria's curiosity grew, and she began to feel a nagging suspicion that the answer might lie closer to home. Maria had been working in the legal world for years, starting her career as a young associate, then building up her reputation in the courtroom one case at a time. What many didn't know was that Maria had recently been elected as the ** president of the State Bar Association **, an influential position that came with significant power within the legal community. She had worked tirelessly to rise through the ranks, focusing on making the legal field more accessible to marginalized groups, advocating for policy changes, and supporting diversity. But Maria had kept her role as Bar Association president low-key, preferring to work behind the scenes. She was known as a skilled lawyer, but her leadership in the Bar Association wasn't something she typically broadcasted. She feared that revealing her position would paint a target on her back, making her an even easier target for those who wanted to maintain the status quo. As Maria connected the dots, she began to wonder if her role within the Bar Association had made her a target. Could Judge James have known about her position, even if she hadn't made it public? It was possible. There were always whispers in the halls of the courthouse, always people who knew more than they let on. Had the judge's decision to fine her been his way of showing that he had power over her, of reminding her and everyone else who was really in control? Maria's instincts told her that there was more to this than just an arrogant judge punishing her for a perceived slight. The more she thought about it, the more she believed that her rise to power within the Bar Association had made her a target for someone who feared change, someone like Judge James, whose authority was threatened by her leadership. Maria wasn't naive enough to believe that every judge or lawyer in the system would welcome her rise, especially given the challenges women of color faced in such a traditionally conservative profession. But the deeper she dug, the more troubling it became. She began asking around, subtly inquiring about Judge James's past cases, speaking with lawyers who had worked under him or in front of him. The stories were there, buried beneath layers of fear and silence. He had a reputation for dismissing the cases of women and people of color with a casual indifference, often issuing harsh judgments or making biased rulings. Those who tried to challenge him faced backlash in the form of delayed cases, professional isolation, or worse. Maria began to see the full scope of the challenge ahead of her. It wasn't just about the fine anymore. It was about justice, integrity, and standing up against the entrenched systems of power that too often silenced those who dared to speak out. She had been working quietly in the background, doing the work of making real, tangible changes to the legal system through her role as bar president. But now she realized that if she was going to fight this battle, she would have to take a more public stand, one that would not only challenge Judge James, but shake the very foundations of the power structures that protected people like him. Maria was ready. As Maria's investigation deepened, the weight of what she was uncovering began to settle in her chest like a stone. She'd always known that the legal system had flaws, but seeing the patterns so clearly, how Judge James had consistently undermined women of color, was a sobering realization. It wasn't just her case. It was part of a broader, more insidious issue that had been festering in the legal community for years. Maria began to piece together the judge's history, tracking his rulings on other cases involving black attorneys and women, and the more she dug, the more alarming the connections became. There were whispers in the courthouse halls, subtle mentions of bias that people were reluctant to acknowledge. But Maria wasn't the type to shy away from the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it was. She gathered records, spoke with former clerks who had worked with Judge James, and dug through old case files. One by one, the stories surfaced. Attorneys, mostly women of color, who had felt the sting of Judge James's unfair treatment. A pattern emerged: harsh sentences, unwarranted fines, dismissals of legitimate evidence. The judge's bias wasn't just incidental, it was ingrained in the way he operated. The revelation hit Maria hard, but it also fueled her resolve. She wasn't the first to experience Judge James's brand of prejudice, and she certainly wouldn't be the last if things didn't change. But Maria wasn't just any attorney. She was the president of the State Bar Association, and that gave her a powerful platform. The idea began to form in her mind, an idea so risky that it almost scared her. She could take this higher, make this a public issue, call for an investigation into the judge's conduct. She could use her position in the Bar Association to challenge him, to shine a light on what so many had been too afraid to address. But as the idea took root, Maria felt the weight of the consequences. Going up against Judge James wasn't just a matter of challenging one person. It was challenging an entire system. He was deeply entrenched in the courthouse hierarchy, with decades of influence behind him. The judge had connections, powerful allies who could make things difficult for her. It wasn't just about fine anymore. It was about her career, her reputation, and everything she had worked for. Maria knew that she couldn't let fear dictate her actions. She had spent too many years fighting for fairness, advocating for the rights of marginalized communities, and climbing the ranks in a field that had never made it easy for her. She couldn't back down now. But she couldn't do it alone. Maria reached out to Lori Grant again, though this time she had a different approach. She wasn't asking for permission or guidance. She was informing Lori about the next steps. "I'm going after him, Lori," Maria said firmly when they spoke on the phone. "I've found the evidence. He's been doing this for years, and it's time someone held him accountable. Lori's voice was hesitant, but there was a clear sense of admiration in it as well. Maria, you're going to make some powerful enemies if you go down this road, she warned. But I can't say I don't admire your determination. I'm not doing it for me, Maria replied. I'm doing it for every lawyer he's bullied, for every woman and person of color he's tried to silence. This stops now. Maria wasn't sure if Lori would fully support her, but she didn't care anymore. She had a duty, not just as a lawyer, but as a leader in the legal community. If she didn't take action, who would? The next day, Maria began drafting a formal complaint to the state's Judicial Review Board, detailing Judge James's history of misconduct and the evidence she had gathered. It was time to step into the light, to use her platform and her position to take down the man who had underestimated her, and to show the world that she wouldn't be silenced. But the moment she clicked send, Maria felt a sense of resolve she had never known before. She was no longer just fighting for a case or for her reputation. She was fighting for the very integrity of the legal system, and she wasn't going to stop until she saw it through. The days following Maria's decision to file the formal complaint were filled with a tense mix of anticipation and fear. She had sent the complaint to the state's Judicial Review Board, a formal body that investigated allegations of judicial misconduct, and now it was out of her hands. Yet in some ways, she had never felt more vulnerable. She was about to challenge a figure of immense power in the legal world, and the fallout from such a move could be severe. Maria tried to focus on her daily work, throwing herself into cases that needed her attention, but her mind often wandered back to Judge James. She could already imagine the conversations happening behind closed doors, how the old guard of the courthouse would react to her challenge. Would they support her? Would they back James because of his influence? Would she be blacklisted, ostracized, or worse? The fear gnawed at her, but it was mixed with an equally strong sense of purpose. Maria knew she was doing the right thing, no matter the consequences. The response from the Judicial Review Board came sooner than she had expected. She was sitting in her office one afternoon when an email notification pinged on her laptop. Her hands trembled slightly as she clicked open the message. It was a confirmation that the board had received her complaint and would begin an investigation. They thanked her for bringing the matter to their attention and assured her that they would handle the case with impartiality. The message was reassuring, but Maria couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was just beginning. The board's response was neutral, which she appreciated, but it didn't change the fact that she was about to challenge a powerful man with deep connections. What if the system was more willing to protect him than her? What if they ignored her complaint or swept it under the rug as they had with others before her? The night after she received the email, Maria stayed up late, thinking. She knew that Judge James wouldn't take this lying down. In the weeks that followed, she braced herself for what was to come. And sure enough, it didn't take long for the first signs of retaliation to appear. It started with small, subtle moves, case assignments being shifted, a few legal partners pulling away from her firm, and some colleagues who had once supported her now avoiding her in the halls. It wasn't blatant, but the message was clear. She was becoming a pariah in the very world she had worked so hard to build. One morning, Maria received an anonymous letter slipped under her office door. The letter contained only a few words, scrawled in messy handwriting. Asterisk, asterisk. You've made a powerful enemy. This won't end well for you. Asterisk, asterisk. Maria's stomach tightened as she read the note, her mind immediately racing. Who was behind it? Was it someone tied to Judge James, or was it just an anonymous attempt to intimidate her? She couldn't be sure, but one thing was certain. The stakes had just gotten higher. The system was fighting back, and Maria needed to be prepared for what lay ahead. Despite the fear creeping in, Maria knew she couldn't back down. She had already come too far, and the work she was doing was bigger than her. The fight wasn't just about her. It was about the future of the legal system, about making sure the voices of marginalized groups were heard, and about ensuring that people like Judge James could no longer get away with the harm they caused. In the weeks that followed, Maria's resolve grew stronger. She reached out to others who had been victims of Judge James' bias, hoping to build a coalition of support. She also began to plan her next steps, preparing for what would likely be a public battle, one that would challenge not only Judge James, but also the institutions that had allowed his behavior to persist unchecked for so long. As she mapped out her strategy, Maria knew that this fight would not be easy. But she also knew one thing for sure. She was ready for it. And this time, she wasn't going to stop until she had secured justice, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been overlooked, mistreated, or silenced in a system that was supposed to be built on fairness. The battle for justice was far from over, and Maria Green was more determined than ever to see it through. As the weeks passed, Maria's resolve only grew stronger. The small attempts to intimidate her, being excluded from legal circles, the anonymous letter, and the subtle shifting of case assignments only fueled her determination. She couldn't let the system continue to protect those like Judge James, people who abused their power and silenced those who dared to challenge them. Maria knew that if she backed down now, she would not only fail herself but every other lawyer, especially women and people of color who had ever faced bias in the courtroom. She had learned that her fight was no longer just about her complaint against Judge James. It was about exposing a broken system that had been shielding biased judges for years, protecting them from accountability. She began gathering a network of allies who had similar stories to share. Former clients, junior attorneys, and even a few brave law clerks who had worked with Judge James began to speak out. One by one, they came forward, sharing their experiences of feeling dismissed, mistreated, or discriminated against. Maria knew this would be a tough road, but it was a road that needed to be walked. The information she gathered from her network, along with her own case against Judge James, began to paint a damning picture of the judge's pattern of behavior. The evidence of bias was irrefutable, but the closer she got to the truth, the more dangerous it became. One evening, Maria was leaving her office late when she saw someone lurking near her car in the parking garage. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The figure was tall, dressed in a dark suit, and his face was obscured by the shadows. As she stepped closer to her car, the man turned to face her. His eyes were cold, calculating. "You're making a mistake, Maria," the man said, his voice low and menacing. Maria's stomach dropped, but she refused to show fear. "What are you talking about?" she asked, standing her ground. "The judge has powerful friends," the man continued. "You're going to regret this. You've been warned." The man turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness of the parking garage. Maria stood frozen for a moment, her mind racing. She had no idea who the man was, but his message was clear. She was stepping into dangerous territory. But as she stood there, a rush of adrenaline coursed through her. She wasn't going to back down now. The threats, the intimidation, none of it would make her stop. Over the next few days, Maria began to prepare for what she knew would be a public fight. She reached out to the media, aware that taking this to the press could escalate things even further. But she needed the public to know the truth about Judge James' actions. She contacted several journalists known for their investigative work, sharing her findings about the judge's past and the evidence she had gathered. The more she revealed, the more she realized the full extent of the judge's corruption and bias. Her case was beginning to gain momentum, and the Judicial Review Board had already started their investigation. But Maria knew that the wheels of justice turned slowly, and with someone as entrenched as Judge James, she couldn't afford to wait. She made her case public, hoping that by shining a spotlight on the issue, she could push the board to act quickly. Within days, the story was all over the news. Journalists reported on the allegations against Judge James, citing Maria's formal complaint and the testimonies of others who had been victims of his bias. The pressure was mounting, and Judge James' allies were starting to feel the heat. The backlash was immediate. Some defended him, calling the accusations unfounded or politically motivated. But others, many who had remained silent for years, began to speak out, rallying behind Maria. Legal experts weighed in, calling for a thorough investigation into the judge's conduct. Public opinion began to turn against him. Maria knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but she was no longer fighting alone. Her courage had sparked something bigger than just her complaint. She had started a movement, and it was only growing stronger. The fight for justice, for accountability, for change, it was just beginning. And Maria Green was ready to lead the charge. As Maria's story gained traction in the media, the pressure on Judge James grew insurmountable. Legal professionals, public advocates, and journalists began to scrutinize his past rulings and behavior more closely. What had once been whispers in the halls of the courthouse was now a full-blown public conversation. For the first time in his career, Judge James found himself on the defensive, something he wasn't accustomed to. He had always been the one in control, the one who dictated the terms of every case that came before him. But now the tables were turning. Maria, meanwhile, continued her work behind the scenes. She met with her allies, those brave enough to speak out about the judge's past abuses, and ensured they were ready to testify, should it come to that. The Judicial Review Board, now under intense public pressure, had already initiated its investigation, but Maria knew the process could take months, maybe even years, before any formal action was taken. She couldn't afford to wait that long. With the media attention reaching new heights, Maria knew the best chance for swift justice lay in creating more momentum. She held press conferences, making it clear that she wasn't backing down. She shared her own experiences with Judge James, recounting how his discriminatory behavior had affected her career and others. As the weeks wore on, Maria found herself at the center of an unprecedented storm. The story was everywhere, in legal publications, on news outlets, across social media. Maria was lauded by many as a hero, a fighter for justice who dared to take on the establishment. Others, however, painted her as a troublemaker, someone stirring up division in a system that, to them, was working just fine. They attacked her credentials, questioned her professionalism, and accused her of using her platform to settle personal scores. One afternoon, Maria received a call from an old colleague, Jason Lyle, who had worked with her early in her career. Jason had been a steady friend and a strong advocate for diversity in law, and Maria had always trusted his judgment. He hesitated before speaking, but his tone was cautious yet supportive. "Maria, I've been following everything," Jason said, "and I just wanted to say, you're doing the right thing. But I also need to warn you that things might get worse. James has allies everywhere. They'll stop at nothing to discredit you." Maria felt a chill at the mention of James's powerful connections, but she refused to be intimidated. "I know what I'm up against, Jason, but I've come this far, and I'm not stopping now. This is about more than me. This is about the system." Jason paused, then spoke again, his voice quieter. "I believe in you, Maria, but be careful. They won't hesitate to go after your reputation, your career. If you're going to fight this, you need to be prepared for a war." That night, as Maria sat in her office, the weight of Jason's words lingered in her mind. He was right. This was going to be a war, one that would test everything she had fought for, every principle she held dear. But the more she thought about it, the clearer it became. She had no choice. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every marginalized person who had been overlooked, silenced, or dismissed by a system designed to protect those in power. As the days turned into weeks, Maria continued to push forward, now with a renewed sense of urgency. She enlisted the help of Tina Moore, a former law clerk who had worked under Judge James and had witnessed his discriminatory practices firsthand. Tina's testimony was a game changer. Her insights into the judge's actions were invaluable. Tina wasn't just another disgruntled ex-employee. She was a credible witness who had seen the inner workings of James's courtroom and could speak to his bias in a way that would make the board take notice. Maria also continued to rally support from colleagues, pushing for a formal petition to be signed by attorneys across the state, calling for the removal of Judge James. She knew that public pressure could sometimes do what the courts could not, move the system faster than it wanted to go. It wasn't just about winning a case anymore. It was about changing the narrative and making sure that no one, no matter how powerful, could escape accountability. Maria had no illusions about the fight ahead. It was going to be messy. It was going to be painful. But the fire inside her had only grown stronger, and she would continue to push until justice was served, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been silenced by the system. The war had only just begun, and Maria Green was determined to lead it. The final showdown came quicker than Maria had anticipated. The Judicial Review Board, under immense pressure from the public and legal community, had accelerated its investigation into Judge James. Maria's complaint, along with the testimonies of Tina Moore and others, had turned the case into something the board could no longer ignore. The scrutiny on the judge had intensified, with media outlets constantly covering every new development, and whispers of his potential impeachment reverberating through the halls of the courthouse. Maria had been preparing for this moment for weeks, knowing that the Judicial Review Board's decision would be the catalyst for the next chapter. She sat in her office one afternoon, reviewing her notes for a press conference she had scheduled. Her phone buzzed, an alert from a legal news website. She clicked the link, and her heart skipped a beat. Asterisk, asterisk, Judge James suspended pending investigation after allegations of discrimination surface, asterisk, asterisk. The headline hit like a wave. Maria read the article carefully. The board had found enough evidence to suspend Judge James while they completed their inquiry into his behavior. It was a temporary victory, but a victory nonetheless. Maria leaned back in her chair, exhaling deeply, but the weight of what was next was already looming. This wasn't the end. The board's suspension was a significant first step, but it was still only temporary. Now the pressure would shift to the investigation itself, and that was where the real fight would unfold. Would Judge James be permanently removed from the bench? Would his actions be fully exposed for the world to see? As Maria processed the news, a mixture of emotions washed over her. The immediate relief of knowing that Judge James was at least temporarily removed from his position was tempered by the knowledge that his allies would not give up easily. She braced herself for the backlash that was sure to follow. True to form, the attacks came swiftly. In the days following the suspension, Judge James's supporters in the legal community began their campaign to discredit Maria. Anonymous messages flooded her inbox, calling her a publicity-seeking opportunist and accusing her of attacking the integrity of the legal profession. Some of her former colleagues, many who had previously shown support, began distancing themselves from her publicly, their silence speaking volumes. But Maria refused to let the noise drown her. She had faced harder challenges than this. She had spent her entire career breaking through barriers, and this fight was no different. Every message of dissent only strengthened her resolve to continue. Then came a letter, an official one from the Judicial Review Board. Maria opened it carefully, expecting the next phase of the investigation to be detailed inside. As she read, her eyes widened. The board was offering her the chance to speak before them, to present her case directly to the members who would ultimately determine James's future. It was a significant moment, a rare opportunity to present not just her own testimony, but also that of all those who had suffered under the judge's biased rulings. Maria's heart raced. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the chance to make her case heard, to demand accountability in a way she had never done before. But she knew it would be a tough session. The board would likely be filled with individuals who had been in the system for years, people who would sympathize with Judge James' reputation or who might have personal ties to him. It would take everything she had to make them listen. She spent the next week preparing for the hearing. She rehearsed her speech not just as a lawyer, but as someone who had fought for fairness and equality her entire life. She knew this was bigger than just a legal dispute. It was a reckoning for the entire system, one that needed to be changed from the inside out. The day of the hearing arrived, and Maria stood before the board, her hands steady despite the nerves that threatened to shake her. She began with her own experience in Judge James' courtroom, recounting every moment of bias she had witnessed and endured. But as she spoke, something powerful happened. She wasn't just telling her story anymore. She was speaking for every person who had been treated unjustly by the system, for every voice that had been silenced. By the time she finished, the room was silent. Maria felt the weight of their eyes on her, but she didn't flinch. She had spoken the truth, and now it was time for the system to face it. Weeks later, the Judicial Review Board delivered its final decision. Judge James was permanently removed from the bench. His history of discriminatory rulings and biased behavior could no longer be ignored. Maria had won, but more importantly, the victory was a symbol that the legal system could be held accountable, that the powerful could be challenged, and that justice, though slow, could still be achieved. Maria Green had fought for justice, and she had won. Her legacy would not be defined by the fight she faced alone, but by the change she had ignited in the system.